Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Imagine a nation forged in the crucible of the Great War, sending its battle-hardened soldiers back into the fray. Their enemy? Not a foreign power, but a formidable feathered opponent native to their own land. This is the almost unbelievable true story of 1932, when the Australian military declared war on its own wildlife, deploying machine guns against a seemingly unstoppable army of emus. It was a conflict that would become infamous, a bizarre chapter in history known as the Great Emu War. In the aftermath of the Great War, a silence fell over the battlefields of Europe, but a roar of expectation echoed across the dominions of the British Empire. Australia, a young nation forged in the fires of Gallipoli and the Western Front, faced a monumental task: how to honor the sacrifice of its returning soldiers. From this question, a grand and ambitious vision was born: a land for heroes. The soldier settlement scheme was more than just policy. It was a national covenant, a promise etched into the very soil of the continent. The government pledged to transform brave soldiers into prosperous farmers, offering them parcels of land, financial assistance, and the chance to build a new life from the ground up. It was a seductive dream, painting a picture of tranquil homesteads, bountiful harvests, and a peaceful existence as a reward for the horrors of war. Across the country, vast tracts of land were acquired and subdivided. Propaganda posters depicted idyllic scenes of muscular, sun-kissed men tilling fertile fields, their families waving from the porches of charming cottages. For thousands of veterans, weary of mud, blood, and the shriek of artillery, this promise was an irresistible siren song. They traded their rifles for plows, their uniforms for work boots, eager to claim their stake in the nation they had fought to protect. The initial optimism was palpable. Men who had spent years in the trenches now dreamed of wheat fields stretching to the horizon and the quiet satisfaction of working their own piece of Australia. They were not just being given land. They were being given a future, a purpose, and a tangible piece of the country's gratitude. This was to be their peace dividend, a chance to cultivate life after witnessing so much death. The nation watched, filled with pride, as its heroes set out to conquer a new frontier, unaware that the stubborn resistance of the Australian bush would prove to be a foe as formidable as any they had faced in Flanders. Nowhere was the promise of a new beginning pursued with more desperate fervor than in the vast, arid interior of Western Australia. This was the wheat belt, a sprawling frontier of rust-colored earth and resilient mallee scrub that stretched for thousands of square kilometers. Here, the government's promises met the harsh reality of the Australian continent. The settlers, many of whom had little to no farming experience, arrived to find their promised land was often an untamed wilderness. The dream of idyllic homesteads quickly gave way to the back-breaking labor of clearing the land. This was a war of attrition, fought with axes, fire, and sheer grit. Giant eucalyptus trees had to be ring-barked, a slow process of strangling the life from them before they could be felled. The dense, interlocking root systems of the mallee scrub had to be grubbed out of the unyielding soil, an exhausting task that could take years. The isolation was profound. Families lived in rudimentary shacks made of corrugated iron and hessian sacks, miles from their nearest neighbors, with only the screech of cockatoos and the vast, indifferent sky for company. Water was a constant, pressing concern. In this semi-arid climate, rainfall was unpredictable, and the settlers had to rely on constructing dams and sinking wells, often with little success. Yet, for a time, the dream held. Armed with relentless determination and new technologies like the stump-jump plow, designed to navigate the rugged terrain, these pioneers slowly carved civilization out of the bush. They planted their first crops of wheat, their hopes rising with every green shoot that pushed through the soil. They were building more than farms. They were building communities from scratch, laying the foundations for towns, schools, and a new agricultural empire. The wheat belt was a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance, a place where the promise of prosperity was paid for daily in sweat, toil, and unwavering hope. Just as the wheat belt settlers began to see the fruits of their immense labor, a dark shadow crept across the globe from the canyons of Wall Street. The Great Depression did not arrive in Australia as a sudden crash, but as a slow, creeping poison that leached the life out of the global economy. For the farmers of the wheat belt, who had wagered everything on the price of wheat and wool, the consequences were catastrophic. The international markets on which their livelihoods depended simply collapsed. The price of wheat plummeted to levels not seen in centuries, falling far below the cost of production. Suddenly, a bumper crop, once a cause for celebration, became a symbol of ruin. Farmers were faced with the heartbreaking reality that it would cost them more to harvest and transport their grain than they could ever hope to sell it for. The banks, which had eagerly extended loans and mortgages during the optimistic post-war years, now came calling. The settlers had borrowed heavily to finance their land, their machinery, and their very survival. With no income, they could not meet their repayments. The dream of owning a piece of Australia curdled into a nightmare of debt and foreclosure. A profound sense of betrayal settled over the land. These men had survived the horrors of war, poured their youth and strength into the unyielding soil, and built communities out of nothing, all based on a national promise. Now that promise felt like a lie. The government that had sent them to this frontier seemed powerless or unwilling to help. The shadow of the Depression brought not just financial ruin, but a deep psychological toll. Hope was replaced by despair. The camaraderie of the pioneer spirit frayed under the strain of poverty. Families who had endured years of hardship were forced to walk away from their land, abandoning their homes and their dreams, defeated not by the harshness of the bush, but by invisible economic forces from half a world away. By 1932, the farmers of the Western Australian wheat belt were on the brink. Crushed by debt and drought, their spirits were as barren as their fields. It was then that nature unleashed its own cruel joke, a final, almost biblical plague upon the struggling settlers. Following their breeding season in the interior, a great migration began. A feathered tide, an estimated 20,000 strong, swept down from the north. They were emus, and they were hungry. For these giant, flightless birds, the struggling wheat farms of the Campion district were an oasis in a parched land. They descended upon the crops with voracious appetites, trampling fences, devouring what little grain had managed to grow, and leaving devastation in their wake. The farmers, many of them decorated veterans of the Great War, were desperate. They saw the emu invasion as the final, insurmountable obstacle. In their desperation, they turned to the government, petitioning the Minister of Defense for military assistance. The request was unusual, but the farmers framed their argument in military terms. They were under siege from a destructive enemy and required machine guns to repel the invasion. Astonishingly, the government agreed. In what would become known as the Great Emu War, the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery was deployed, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Major G.P.W. Meredith led the expedition, confident of a swift victory against an avian foe. The reality, however, proved farcical. The emus were tactical geniuses. They broke into small, fast-moving groups, refusing to present a large target. They were surprisingly resilient to gunfire and could maintain high speeds even when wounded. The machine guns, mounted on trucks, struggled to keep pace over the rough terrain. After several frustrating and largely fruitless engagements, the military campaign was an embarrassing failure. The press had a field day. The emus had won. The military withdrew, leaving the farmers to their fate, defeated by a feathered army that had succeeded where the German army had failed. In the vast, sun-scorched expanse of Western Australia, a new kind of crisis was brewing, one far removed from the political intrigues of European courts, but no less existential for those it affected. Following the Great War, the Australian government had settled thousands of veterans on marginal farming lands, promising them a prosperous new beginning. These men, who had faced the horrors of the trenches, now faced a different kind of battle against the unforgiving elements. They plowed their hopes into the soil, cultivating wheat in districts like Campion and Walgulan. However, the global economic collapse of the Great Depression had already pushed them to the brink. Wheat prices plummeted, and the promised prosperity felt like a cruel mirage. It was into this landscape of hardship and simmering desperation that a new enemy marched. Following their breeding season in the interior, an immense feathered army began its annual migration towards the coast. This was the emu, a bird of formidable size and resilience. But this year, their numbers were unprecedented. An estimated 20,000 of these flightless giants descended upon the farmlands. Drawn by the cleared land and the artificial water sources the farmers had established, the emus found the burgeoning wheat crops to be an irresistible banquet. They were not merely passing through, they were occupying. Standing up to 6 feet tall and capable of running at speeds of 30 miles per hour, the emus were a force of nature. Their powerful legs could tear through fences with ease, and their sheer numbers transformed the landscape into a moving sea of gray-brown feathers. For the soldier settlers, this was not just a pest problem. It was an invasion. They watched as their livelihoods, the very crops that were meant to feed their families and pay their debts, were systematically devoured and trampled. This was not a random act of nature. It was a siege, a relentless wave of destruction that their rifles and scarecrows were powerless to stop. The enemy was at their gates, and it was an army unlike any they had ever faced before. The arrival of the Emu Legion brought with it a wave of devastation that swept across the wheat belt with terrifying efficiency. The destruction was not subtle. It was a comprehensive and systematic dismantling of the farmers' hard-won progress. Each day, the settlers would wake to find more of their land rendered barren. The emus, with their voracious appetites, consumed shocking quantities of wheat. but the damage they inflicted went far beyond mere consumption. Their large, clumsy feet trampled vast swathes of crops, flattening acres of promising grain into the dusty soil, rendering it completely unharvestable. What they didn't eat, they ruined. The most significant collateral damage, however, was to the fences. The farmers had erected rabbit-proof fencing, a critical defense not only against the emus, but also against the plague of rabbits that could strip a field bare in days. The emus, powerful and seemingly oblivious to these barriers, charged directly through them. They created huge gaps in the wire mesh, effectively opening gateways for swarms of rabbits and other pests to pour into the cultivated lands. The result was a multi-front disaster. While the emus targeted the wheat, the rabbits followed in their wake, compounding the destruction. The fields became a tableau of agricultural ruin. What were once orderly rows of green shoots became chaotic patchworks of trampled earth and gnawed stalks. The economic impact was immediate and catastrophic. With wheat prices already at rock bottom due to the Depression, every bushel lost was a nail in the coffin of a family's financial survival. The farmers, many of whom were already deeply in debt to the government for their land and equipment, watched their one chance of solvency being consumed before their very eyes. This wasn't just a loss of profit. It was the erasure of a year's worth of back-breaking labor and the evaporation of hope. The fields of Western Australia were no longer symbols of a new beginning. They had become desolate battlegrounds, monuments to the farmers' losing war against nature. As the days turned into weeks, the farmers' initial attempts to combat the emu scourge grew increasingly desperate and futile. They were men who had faced down enemy artillery in Europe, yet they were utterly outmaneuvered by these giant, unpredictable birds. Their personal firearms, typically single-shot rifles, were hopelessly inadequate against the sheer number and surprising speed of their feathered foes. A single shot might bring down one emu, but the rest of the flock would scatter in all directions, trampling even more crops in their panicked retreat. Building stronger fences was a costly and labor-intensive solution that most simply could not afford, and even reinforced barriers often proved no match for a determined mob of emus. Realizing they were fighting a losing battle on their own, the community of soldier settlers decided on a drastic course of action. They had been soldiers, and they saw this as a military problem that required a military solution. A delegation of these farmer veterans was organized. They made the long journey to Perth to appeal directly to the highest levels of government. Their target was the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce. In a meeting that would become legendary, the farmers laid out their case. They weren't asking for financial subsidies or agricultural aid. Their request was far more unorthodox. They formally petitioned the Australian government to deploy the military. Specifically, they requested the use of machine guns. They argued that the emus were an invading force, a non-native pest in their cultivated lands, and that conventional methods of control had failed completely. They leveraged their status as war veterans, appealing to the government's sense of duty to the men they had sent to fight overseas, and then settled on this harsh frontier. This was their new war, they argued, and they needed the army's weapons to fight it. It was a desperate, almost unbelievable plea, a request for the government to officially declare war on a species of bird. The farmers' cry for help was not just about saving their crops. It was about saving their futures from an enemy they could not defeat alone. The farmers' extraordinary request landed on the desk of a receptive audience. Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defence, was a seasoned politician and himself a senator for Western Australia. He was keenly aware of the plight of the farmers in his state and sympathetic to the veterans among them. Faced with this bizarre yet earnest plea, he saw not just a problem, but an opportunity. The request offered a chance for some positive publicity, portraying the government as actively assisting the struggling agricultural sector and supporting its war heroes. Furthermore, the military saw a practical benefit. It was a perfect chance for some real-world target practice with the Lewis machine guns, a weapon whose effectiveness in the field was always being evaluated. Thus, in a decision that would cement this episode in the annals of absurd history, the Australian government agreed. A formal military operation was authorized. The press, sensing a peculiar and compelling story, latched onto the news with enthusiasm. Headlines began to appear, and the conflict was officially, if unofficially, christened the Great Emu War. The command of this strange expedition was given to Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. He was dispatched from Perth with a small contingent consisting of 2 soldiers, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran. Their arsenal was formidable: 2 Lewis automatic machine guns and a staggering 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was for the military to provide the guns and the gunners, while the local farmers would provide food, lodging, and transport, and would be responsible for paying for the ammunition. The stage was set for one of the most unusual conflicts in military history. As Major Meredith and his men journeyed towards the Campion district in late October 1932, a sense of anticipation filled the air. Soldiers, armed with weapons of modern warfare, were about to engage an army of flightless birds. No one could have predicted the humiliating turn of events that was about to unfold. While the great legal cannons of the Legatine Court were being positioned in London, King Henry initiated a second, clandestine front in his war for an annulment. He understood that the court's verdict could be swayed by the weight of scholarly opinion. If he could prove that the most learned men and institutions in Christendom supported his case, it would be difficult for the papal legates to rule against him. This led to a series of covert operations across Europe, missions undertaken by the king's most trusted and intelligent agents. We can think of these men as archetypes, figures like a Major Meredith, tasked with a mission of critical importance: to secure the intellectual high ground. The most prominent of these real-life agents were men like Stephen Gardner and Edward Fox, brilliant, ruthless servants of the Tudor state. Their mission was to tour the great universities of France and Italy, Paris, Orléans, Bologna, Padua, and extract favorable judgments on the king's great matter. The objective was simple: to get these prestigious faculties of theology and law to declare that Henry's marriage to his brother's widow was, and always had been, invalid according to divine law. The methods, however, were anything but simple. These missions were a delicate dance of diplomacy, academic flattery, intellectual debate, and outright bribery. Royal gold flowed freely into the coffers of universities and the pockets of influential professors. Where persuasion failed, intimidation was applied. The agents of the English king reminded university heads of the political and economic power wielded by Henry and his powerful ally, the King of France. It was a dirty, exhausting business, fought in dusty libraries and shadowy university cloisters. Each favorable opinion was a victory, a piece of ammunition to be shipped back to England and presented to the court. This intellectual offensive was designed to create an unstoppable wave of support, to show that Henry's conscience was not a matter of personal desire, but a reflection of learned, pious opinion across the continent. For Catherine, this campaign was a deep betrayal, as the very institutions meant to uphold the sanctity of marriage were being corrupted to destroy hers. The Great Legatine Court at Black Friars, the heavy battery Henry had deployed with such confidence, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. In July 1529, Cardinal Campeggio, following secret instructions from Rome, adjourned the proceedings and recalled the case to the papal court. The strategy had failed. Henry was left humiliated and furious, his path to Anne Boleyn and a male heir blocked indefinitely. The failure cost Cardinal Wolsey everything. Stripped of his power and wealth, he would die a year later on his way to face charges of treason. The king's rage and desperation created a power vacuum, a moment of profound crisis that demanded a new, more radical solution. The old weapons, diplomacy, papal law, theological debate, had proven ineffective. It was time for a new kind of warfare, and into the void stepped the men who would provide it. Metaphorically, the Lewis guns had arrived. These were not soldiers, but men of ideas, men of a different caliber entirely. Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. They were the architects of a revolution. Cromwell, a lawyer of breathtaking intelligence and ruthless pragmatism, saw a political solution where others saw only a theological problem. Cranmer, a scholar with reformist sympathies, provided the theological framework. Their proposal, whispered into the king's receptive ear, was as simple as it was earth-shattering. Why beg for permission from a foreign pope, a pope who was himself a prisoner of Catherine's nephew? The solution was to eliminate the pope from the equation altogether. They argued for the principle of royal supremacy, that the King of England was, and always had been, the supreme authority in all matters spiritual and temporal within his own realm. This was a weapon unlike any other. It was not a slow, ponderous cannonball of canon law, but a rapid-fire, devastatingly effective doctrine that could sweep away centuries of tradition. It would not just grant Henry his annulment. It would make him the master of the Church, its wealth, and its power. The arrival of Cromwell and Cranmer into Henry's inner circle marked the true beginning of the end for Catherine. Her fight was no longer just against her husband, but against a revolutionary idea that would reforge the English state and sever its ties to Catholic Europe forever. On the 21st of June, 1529, the Legatine Court at Black Friars formally opened its proceedings. The Great Hall was packed with the nobility, clergy, and lawyers of England. On a raised dais sat the two prince cardinals, Wolsey and Campeggio, in their scarlet robes. Before them, on separate thrones, sat King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of years of maneuvering. The king spoke first, delivering a speech full of feigned regret, claiming his conscience was troubled by the legitimacy of his marriage. It was a carefully prepared performance of piety. Then it was Catherine's turn to answer the charges. What happened next was not a legal argument, but an act of astonishing courage that silenced the entire court. It was the first direct contact of the battle, a confrontation not with the court but with the king himself. Ignoring the cardinals, Catherine rose from her chair, walked across the floor, and knelt at her husband's feet. The gesture was a profound act of submission, yet her words were a powerful and unwavering defense. Speaking in English for all to hear, she addressed Henry directly, her voice filled with 20 years of shared history. "Sir," she began, "I beseech you for all the loves that hath been between us, take some pity on me, and do me justice." She reminded him of her loyalty, of her status as a foreign princess who had left everything behind for him. She defended her honor with a declaration that stunned the onlookers, asserting that she had been a virgin when she came to his bed. "When ye had me at the first," she declared, "I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man." She spoke of their daughter, Mary, and pleaded with him not to make her a bastard. It was a direct, emotional, and deeply personal appeal, bypassing the legal machinery entirely. Having said her piece, she rose, made a low curtsy to the king, and walked towards the exit. When called back by the court crier, she simply said, "It is no indifferent court for me," and left the hall, never to return. In this Battle of Campion, this confrontation before Campeggio's court, Catherine had lost the legal skirmish by refusing to participate, but she had won a major moral victory, demonstrating a regal dignity that shamed the king's proceedings. Following the dramatic proceedings at Black Friars, where Catherine had so powerfully confronted her husband and king, the battle for the royal marriage entered a new, more treacherous phase. Henry, thwarted in his attempt to secure a quick annulment on home soil, was enraged. But Catherine, now separated from court and confined to a series of increasingly remote residences, transformed from a public queen into an invincible general of a war fought not with soldiers, but with conviction, law, and diplomacy. Her strategy was one of magnificent, unyielding obstinance, a tactic as frustrating and unpredictable to her enemies as the zigzagging run of an emu. She would not deviate, she would not negotiate, and she would not surrender her title or her daughter's legitimacy. This was her singular, powerful maneuver. From her gilded cages at the Moor, Ampthill, and later Buckden, Catherine orchestrated a formidable defense. Her primary weapon was her connection to the most powerful man in Europe, her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Her letters, smuggled out by loyal servants, flew across the continent, pleading her case and ensuring that the emperor applied relentless pressure on Pope Clement VII. She understood that her battle was no longer truly in England, but in the complex political theater of Rome. Within England, she refused to acknowledge the authority of any court that superseded the popes. When delegations arrived demanding she accept a lesser title like Dowager Princess of Wales, she met them with the unshakable authority of a consecrated queen. She would correct their protocol, insist on being served as queen, and dismiss their arguments with a blend of theological certainty and regal disdain. This constant, unwavering refusal to bend was her core tactic. It forced Henry's hand, pushing him towards ever more radical solutions. He could strip her of her household, separate her from her daughter, and declare her marriage void. But he could not break her will. Her invincibility was not of the battlefield, but of the soul. and her tactics were designed to win a war of attrition for the conscience of Christendom. While Catherine herself remained the immovable center of the resistance, a network of supporters across England began to wage a form of guerrilla warfare on her behalf. This was not a conflict of swords and sieges, but one of whispers, sermons, pamphlets, and clandestine loyalties. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of the English people, fought in the shadows against the overwhelming power of the crown. The commanders of this intellectual insurgency were men of profound principle, most notably Bishop John Fisher and the former Chancellor, Sir Thomas More. These were not soldiers, but scholars and churchmen who wielded words as their weapons. From the pulpit, Fisher preached veiled sermons on the sanctity of marriage and the indissoluble bond between king and queen, his words resonating with a populace deeply sympathetic to Catherine's plight. Thomas More, having resigned the chancellorship rather than support the king's break with Rome, engaged in a brilliant, subtle war of letters and publications, defending papal authority without ever naming the king directly. Their actions inspired a wider, more diffuse resistance. Anonymous pamphlets appeared on the streets of London, defending the Queen and denouncing the Great Matter. Monks and friars, particularly from the observant Franciscan order to which Catherine was devoted, became her most vocal champions, risking imprisonment and death to speak truth to power. This underground war even had its own prophetess, Elizabeth Barton, the nun of Kent, whose divine visions warned of dire consequences should Henry cast Catherine aside. Her prophecies spread like wildfire, tapping into the deep well of popular piety and superstition, and for a time, she presented a genuine threat to the regime's stability. This was guerrilla warfare in its truest sense, asymmetrical, decentralized, and deeply rooted in the convictions of the people. While Henry and Cromwell controlled the official instruments of state, Catherine's allies fought back from the margins, proving that a queen in isolation could still command an army of loyal consciences. By 1533, Henry VIII and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell had grown tired of the lingering resistance. With Anne Boleyn pregnant, time was of the essence. They decided to construct an elaborate legal and political trap, a dam designed to finally break Catherine's will and wash away her claims forever. This was to be the ultimate ambush. The plan was multifaceted, culminating in the Act of Succession. This legislation not only declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void from the beginning, but also illegitimized their daughter, Mary, and established the children of Henry and Anne as the rightful heirs to the throne. To refuse the oath acknowledging this act was to commit treason. The trap was set. The ambush was sprung not with an army, but with a delegation of grim-faced counselors, including the Duke of Suffolk, sent to Catherine's residence at Buckden. Their mission was simple: force her to accept the new reality, relinquish the title of queen, and swear the oath. They arrived with all the pomp and menace the state could muster, expecting to finally overwhelm the isolated woman. What they encountered was not a broken victim, but a queen as resolute as ever. Catherine met them not in a chamber of state, but in her private rooms, reinforcing that she was their queen and they were intruding. When they addressed her as the Princess Dowager, she calmly but firmly corrected them, stating, "I am Queen of England, the King's true wife." She listened to their threats and legal arguments and then dismantled them with a powerful, unwavering defense of her own. She declared that she had been anointed and crowned queen by the authority of the Pope, and no English court or parliament could undo what God had sanctioned. She would not take the oath, for it would invalidate her marriage, bastardize her child, and imperil her soul. The dam had been built, but Catherine refused to be swept away. The ambush had failed. The king's men left Bucton empty-handed, their strategy in ruins, having discovered that legal force was useless against the force of Catherine's conscience. She had turned their moment of triumph into yet another testament to her enduring defiance. In the final years of her life, the great conflict between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon settled into a bitter and humiliating stalemate. Henry had achieved his practical goals. He had a new queen in Anne Boleyn, a new male heir in Prince Edward, and a new church with himself at its head. He held all the power, all the wealth, and all the authority of the English crown. Yet, he had failed to secure the one prize he arguably craved the most: the submission of his first wife. Catherine, for her part, had lost everything. She was confined to the damp and decaying Kimbolton Castle, stripped of her titles, her servants, and, most cruelly, her daughter Mary, whom she was forbidden to see. She was Queen of England in name only, a prisoner in the kingdom she had once ruled. Yet, she had held on to the one thing that mattered: her truth. She never, not for a single moment, acknowledged the annulment or relinquished her claim to be Henry's lawful wife and queen. This impasse was a source of profound humiliation for both. For Henry, it was a constant, galling reminder of his limits. The most powerful monarch in English history was being openly defied by a lone, ailing woman. His new marriage was seen as illegitimate by most of Catholic Europe, and his new queen was widely despised as a usurper. The shadow of Catherine, the true and righteous queen in the eyes of many of his subjects, loomed over his new life, tainting his triumphs. For Catherine, the stalemate was a daily agony. Her piety was her strength, but also the source of her suffering. Every day was a testament to her losses, a painful separation from the daughter she adored. She maintained a small, austere household, her days spent in fervent prayer, writing letters to the Pope and her nephew, and signing every one of them Catherine the Queen. It was a war with no victors, only casualties. Henry had his power, but no peace of mind. Catherine had her integrity, but no freedom. The kingdom remained spiritually fractured, caught between a king who demanded obedience and a queen who embodied defiance, locked in a stalemate that would only be broken by death. The failure of the legatine court at Black Friars in 1529 did not end the king's great matter. It merely changed the battlefield. The conflict moved from the courtroom into the courts of public opinion and political manipulation. For Catherine of Aragon, this was a period of profound isolation and psychological warfare. Henry, seething with frustration, separated her from the main court and, most cruelly, from their daughter, Mary. Catherine was shunted from one royal residence to another: the Moor, Ampthill, Bucton, each move taking her further from the heart of power and deeper into a gilded cage. Yet she refused to be silenced. Her defiance became the central, unwavering story in a nation rife with gossip and uncertainty. While the king's propagandists, fueled by the rising influence of Thomas Cromwell, worked tirelessly to paint her as a stubborn, foreign obstacle to the kingdom's future, the common people saw something else entirely. To them, she was their rightful, anointed queen, a pious and wronged woman suffering for her principles. Her cause became a national obsession, a war in the headlines of its day, whispered in taverns and debated in marketplaces. Every pamphlet published, every sermon preached, was a volley in this ongoing conflict. Catherine's strategy was one of steadfast legal and moral resistance. She had appealed her case directly to Pope Clement VII in Rome, a move that infuriated Henry, but grounded her cause in the ultimate authority of the Church. She wrote constantly to her powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, urging him to apply political pressure on the papacy. She understood that her marriage was not just a personal vow, but a sacrament and a cornerstone of European political stability. Her refusal to accept any compromise, to retire to a nunnery, or to accept the judgment of a biased English court, was not born of foolish pride, but of a deep, unshakable conviction in the sanctity of her marriage and the legitimacy of her child. She was a queen fighting not just for her crown, but for her soul and her daughter's birthright. King Henry VIII's patience had finally shattered. With Catherine's case stalled in Rome and Anne Boleyn now pregnant with a potential male heir, the king could wait no longer. The solution, radical and revolutionary, was to sever the centuries-old ties that bound England to the authority of the Pope. The death of the conservative Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, provided the perfect opportunity. In his place, Henry appointed the reform-minded Thomas Cranmer, a man who would prove instrumental in achieving the king's desires. The legislative assault began in earnest. In early 1533, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, a landmark piece of legislation drafted by Thomas Cromwell. This act declared England an empire governed by one supreme head, the king, and forbade all appeals to foreign tribunals, namely, the papacy in Rome. In a single stroke, Catherine's primary legal defense was dismantled. She was now trapped within the English legal system, a system entirely controlled by the man who sought to discard her. With the path cleared, events moved with breathtaking speed. In secret, Henry had already married Anne Boleyn. Now Archbishop Cranmer convened a special court at Dunstable Priory, conveniently close to Catherine's residence at Ampthill, to finally rule on the validity of her marriage to Henry. Catherine was summoned to appear, but she refused. She knew it was a show trial with a predetermined outcome. Her non-attendance was recorded as contempt, and on May 23, 1533, Cranmer declared her 24-year marriage to Henry null and void from the very beginning. The formal order came soon after. She was to withdraw from her status as queen. She was stripped of her title, her household was to be reduced, and she was henceforth to be known only by the humiliating title of Dowager Princess of Wales, a constant reminder of her first, brief marriage to Prince Arthur. This was the ultimate order to withdraw, not just from court, but from her identity, her history, and her life's purpose. Having legally nullified his first marriage, Henry launched a second, more personal offensive designed to break Catherine's spirit completely. The goal was simple: force her to accept her new, diminished status as Dowager Princess of Wales, and by extension acknowledge the legitimacy of his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the succession of their offspring. This campaign of psychological pressure was relentless. Catherine was moved to more remote and less salubrious locations, culminating in her effective imprisonment at Kimbolton Castle, a damp and isolated manor in the Fens. Her world shrank, but her resolve hardened. A delegation led by the Duke of Suffolk was dispatched to inform her of the changes and demand her compliance. When they addressed her as Princess Dowager, she calmly corrected them, stating she was the king's true wife and queen. She refused to surrender her royal jewels and demanded a copy of the proceedings from Cranmer's court, which she promptly dismissed as invalid. The pressure intensified with the passage of the 1534 Act of Succession. This act required all of the king's subjects to swear an oath recognizing Anne's children as the legitimate heirs to the throne. To refuse was treason. For Catherine, taking this oath was unthinkable. It would mean renouncing her marriage, declaring her own daughter a bastard, and invalidating her entire life. She refused, an act of supreme defiance that put her in mortal danger. Her staunchest supporters, like Bishop John Fisher and Sir Thomas More, also refused the oath and would ultimately pay with their lives. The most painful blow in this offensive was the complete separation from her daughter. Mary, who shared her mother's courage and conviction, also refused the oath. As punishment, she was stripped of her title of princess, her household was dissolved, and she was placed in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, effectively as a lady-in-waiting. Mother and daughter were forbidden from seeing or even corresponding with one another, a cruelty that tormented Catherine until her dying day. Confined to the cold, damp rooms of Kimbolton Castle, Catherine of Aragon's health began to fail. Years of stress, heartbreak, and harsh living conditions took their toll on the once vibrant Spanish princess. Yet, even in her final days, she never wavered. Her foe was not a feathered creature, but a king's obsession and a nascent state church, and her legacy would be one of unyielding principle. In the winter of 1535, she became gravely ill, likely with a form of cancer. Her devoted physician and a few loyal servants attended her, but her pleas to see her daughter one last time were cruelly denied by the king. Knowing the end was near, she dictated a final remarkable letter to Henry. In it, she offered him her forgiveness, expressed her concern for his soul, and commended their daughter Mary to his fatherly care. In a final act of defiance and self-affirmation, she signed it, Catherine the Queen. She died on January 7, 1536. An autopsy, conducted by her physician, revealed a black growth upon her heart, which led to immediate and widespread rumors of poison at the hands of Anne Boleyn. While modern historians attribute her death to cancer, the suspicion reveals the high esteem in which the public still held her. Her death, far from being the end of the story, was a pivotal moment. It paradoxically cleared the path for Anne Boleyn's own downfall just a few months later. But Catherine's true legacy was forged in her decades of resilience. Her steadfast adherence to her Catholic faith and the authority of the Pope provided a powerful rallying point for religious conservatives in England for generations. More importantly, she instilled that same unshakable faith and sense of legitimacy in her daughter. It was Catherine's example that fueled Mary's determination to survive years of persecution and eventually take the throne as Queen Mary the Vour, where she would fiercely, if bloodily, attempt to restore the Catholic faith her mother had died defending. Catherine of Aragon was not forgotten. She was the queen whose conscience inadvertently triggered the English Reformation, and whose strength of character shaped a future queen, ensuring her story would echo through the annals of history.